on the cloud. And then, Kenza, if it's okay, I can also do like a quick introduction.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
sounds great.
All right. Yeah. Because this is like part of like a larger series that we're doing at ACSP that is about cultivating mentorship for growth. So like last month we were talking about writing. We have also just generally writing and also like book writing. But something that is like very important for a lot of planners is like how we use or research that we're doing to actually just inform policy, right? And in particular, it's like how can we engage with federal policy, just thinking about the processes. And I know that you have a lot of practical insights along with like Brooke because you're working on this all the time. And I had the opportunity to also, it was like last May, so now it's a while, it's gonna be like almost a year. Went with the National Income Housing Coalition to also do some advocacy. But I haven't done it in a while. I did it when I was an intern at the National Income Housing Coalition and did that. And I have like few opportunities of doing that, but part of it is like I saw that you guys do very well the advocacy 101, right?
Mhm.
And just like learning more about that, it seems very important for educators and researchers. So basically, like in this session, what we are going to examine is like how researchers can influence with it can engage and also influence federal policy processes. And then we will
Mhm.
draw um, on some advocacy practice as illustrative examples, right? So the idea is like you can take this and think about transportation, or you can think about the environment. Obviously, you're like housing advocate, so you're going to talk about those examples in particular, but hopefully some of the things that you will learn will be translated into other types of policy conversations as well. But also we're kind of like concentrated on like federal institutions. So there's all kinds of things that also people can do at the local level to engage with policy relevant work. But here we're going to concentrate on federal policy specifically. And so I just wanted to just say a little bit about you. So it's a
Mhm.
Kenza Idrissi Janati is a housing advocacy coordinator at the National Income Housing Coalition, where she works to expand and mobilize national advocacy networks around federal housing policy. Her experience spans research, legislative advocacy, and tenant engagement, including roles with HUD and the Bipartisan Policy Center. And she brings a strong commitment to centering lived experience in housing policy work. I understand that you are going to do the presentation and that Brooke in some points might like intercept or be here for like questions and all that. And thank you, Brooke, for also be here. And Brooke is She Parade. I hope that I said the last name correctly. Brooke is a senior director of field strategy and innovation at the National Income Housing Coalition, where she leads national outreach, organizing, and advocacy efforts with a background in social work and coalition building. And she has worked extensively on advancing equitable housing policy and expanding housing access for vulnerable populations. And the last thing I wanted to say as a disclaimer, because you guys are like a 501(c)(4, you do advocacy group, right? We're a 501(c)(3. We're not necessarily supporting the particular things that you bring up, right? So, but if people wanted to do that, you can also I think that at the end you might tell us a little bit about how to engage for the people that might be interested. But I wanted to just like say that as a disclosure for ACSP. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ivis. Thanks for the introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and do this discussion with you all that I've titled From Research to Relevance and how researchers can engage with federal policymaking. As Ivis said, I'm Kenza. I'm a housing advocacy coordinator on the field strategy and innovation team, and I'm with the National Income Housing Coalition. And next slide, Brooke. I was gonna say before that, you guys can feel free to interrupt me at any time, get off mute. I'm gonna pose a couple questions here and there throughout the presentation, so you guys can feel free to share in the chat or say it out loud. But just to give you all a bit of an outline for today's conversation, I'm going to first introduce you all to sort of our work and mission. I'm going to share a little bit about our research on housing needs and some of our housing policy solutions that really make up the bulk of our priority work in the policy space, and then actually walk you through some of our process on sort of taking the policy, taking the research, and how we advocate for those things, and how we make them sort of relevant, and how do we meet the moment that we're currently in right now in the housing space. And so next slide. So you're probably wondering, who are you? So Ivis gave me a great introduction, but I'll just share a little bit more about what I do day to day. So I'm a regional organizer, and so that basically means that while we all, as a coalition, support our federal advocacy efforts, I have the really great pleasure of working with partners and members on the ground from a specific region. So I cover parts of the South, I cover parts of the Southwest, and then some parts of the Mountain West regions of the United States. So I work extensively with partners there and members there, communicating some of our asks and calls to action, but then also hearing from them on how they can sort of influence federal policies in their own ways, or even sometimes how we can support their work, even if it's not at the federal level, right? So that we have sometimes um, members and partners who come and ask us, how do I approach this sort of state bill? We feel like it's connected to something happening at the federal level, and so we engage in that way as well. So it's really open-ended, and we think about it as partnerships, and so it's always back and forth. Um, and I actually started, my housing career a little bit, actually doing qualitative research on the ground with housing voucher recipients. So I really do have a deep appreciation for the researchers in the room, and what you all do. And I also have experience working on like the policy and programming aspect at the federal level, federal government level, and then also did a little bit of research and policy work on housing before I came to NLHC. And then now I focus more on the advocacy piece. And I would say, like, as my mission, I guess, through my role is to really, like Iva said, strengthen the base in my region to ensure that we have more advocates who are coming from all parts of the United States and all kinds of communities. And not just housing advocates, but even those who are doing intersecting work and bringing them into the fold as well. So we can bring a strong base of advocates together for when things come up, and we can lean on them and they can lean on us for support. Next slide, Brooke. And just to ground you all, I guess, in our mission as a coalition, we are an organization that we say is dedicated to achieving racially and socially equitable public policy that ensures that people with the lowest incomes have quality homes that are affordable and accessible in communities of their choice. And so here I want to kind of strongly emphasize two kind of elements. One, that we dedicate ourselves to racially and socially just, equitable public policy. And I'll come back a little bit to that, but I think it does influence the way we approach our research and the way we approach our policy and our advocacy. And then we also specifically focus on people with the lowest incomes and renters specifically. So this really, I think, differentiates us, makes us kind of unique as an organization, compared to maybe some other national housing groups, because we really do focus on where the greatest need actually is. And we really key in on those who are renters with the lowest incomes. Next slide, Brooke. And so you're also probably wondering, right, like, who makes up our coalition, right? A coalition is a very broad term. But our coalition, I would say, is built of like a pretty diverse range of folks. We see all types of members coming in, and requesting to join as members. We do really pride ourselves, I will say, on actively working to bring in more people with lived experience into our coalition. That is the fabric of kind of our organization, how we got started. We want people who can bring in their lived experience of housing insecurity, homelessness, and who can really, who can really center us and ground us in our work. Um, and our coalition also includes people who are working in the homelessness space, people who are working at housing authorities, public housing authorities across the United States. We're talking about legal aid groups, talking about researchers, which are really critical, government agencies, housing developers, property managers, students, and other service providers. And I'll say, this is such a broad range of folks, and there's maybe things that maybe categories we haven't hit on. And these all bring in different assets. But the really good thing about our coalition, I think, is that we're able to influence our system in different ways. So we can touch at different key points, right? Like something a researcher can provide may be different than a government agency. Sometimes government agencies can't be outspoken and advocate in the same way that maybe a tenant leader or a legal aid group can. So we lean on our strengths and we lean on our limits as well, and we kind of find power within each other to be able to advocate for the things that we find important. And I'll point out here, I think researchers play a really critical role. We don't need, I mean, we need researchers not only help us illustrate evidence on why we need more deeply affordable housing and cost burdens, which I'll go into in a little bit, but we need researchers because it'll tell us how effective our programs are actually becoming, right? Like once you implement something, you need that evaluation piece. And so we lean on people on the ground to tell us sort of how this program that we've advocated or not advocated for, like how it's actually being implemented on the ground. So we're asking ourselves the questions of like, are tenants living in habitable conditions? What protections do they rely on, right? So these are all the questions that we ask ourselves as a coalition, especially our research team, but we also, sort of seek those answers out into the field as well, which I think is a really symbiotic way of looking at things. And I'll note too that many times, maybe some of you here in the audience or maybe your organizations, researchers outside of our coalition, meaning not on our staff, also take our data and use it to further conceptualize the realities that are happening on the ground and using it as a framing to look into maybe more qualitative sort of understandings of housing needs. And I think this will take me to my next slide, which I'll talk a little bit about our gap report. So every year, the coalition, especially our research team, publishes an annual report called The Gap. And this is to demonstrate the shortage of affordable and available homes across the United States. And it's probably not a surprise to all of you, those who are working in maybe the planning space, that no state, in the United States has an adequate supply of affordable and available rental homes for the lowest income renters. Nationally, just to put it into some perspective, there is a shortage of about 7.2 million affordable and available rental homes for every 11 million extremely low income renter households. And that also means that 35 affordable and available homes exist for every 100 of these low income renters. And just to define a few things here, because I think sometimes definitions are really important. When we talk about extremely low income or ELI households, we mean households with incomes at or below either the federal poverty guideline or 30% of AMI, average median income, which is actually higher. And additionally, when we say affordable and available, we actually mean rental units that are both affordable and two, either vacant or not preoccupied by a higher income household. So in this, we're actually acknowledging that there might be affordable housing stock, right, in the market, right, or not necessarily in the market or being taken up, but it's actually not being occupied by people who need it, right? It's being occupied by other income groups who are also cost burdened, because what we know about the high cost of rent affects everyone. But what we do know is that those who need the housing the most, those with the lowest incomes, are not able to access that housing because some of it is taken up by those with higher income brackets. And so, this is a pretty wide and expansive national data I kind of laid out for you guys. So we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into like the state level data just to illustrate how we report on these things more specifically for our network. National data is great, right? But when we can really key in on some of the state or even congressional level data, this is where it becomes a little bit more useful. So next slide. So we're going to use Texas as an example today, just given that our friends at Texas A&M are, from Texas and they're hosting us, but also because Texas falls within my region as an organizer. So I work closely with our partners there and some of our members, and we know that they utilize our data. Um, so similar to the national data that I just shared, Texas is just definitely not an outlier to this issue of the lack of affordable and available homes. In our gap report, we also publish these state profiles and even these congressional profiles. So it goes at the state level, which I'm showing you now, but there's also congressional data that's going to come out that gets way more hyper localized. But as you can see from the graph on the left, in Texas, there are only 25 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 ELI households. And if you remember from what I said before, I said 35 affordable and available homes exist for every 100 of low-income renters across the United States. So Texas is actually below the national average. And if you saw the other graph, they were actually in that really dark red region, which means that they are experiencing a really high level of need. And Texas as a state alone would need about 709,000 more of homes affordable for ELI households to meet that need. And this, we advocate and we want it through the expansion of rental assistance, and we also just need to build more deeply affordable rental homes across the state. Um, and just to put it into a little bit more context here is on the right graph, I show or this graph illustrates really that extremely low income renters make up the majority of severely cost burden renters. And just to define a little bit what cost burden means in our context here, when we say cost burden, we mean a household that's spending more than 30% of income on housing costs. And then when we say severely cost burdened, we mean those who spend more than 50% of household income on housing costs. And so that's how we come up with that number and that sort of data on that. So just to put sort of these two graphs in conversation with one another, what they tell us is that one, there's just not enough affordable housing stock for ELI households. And as a result, those in ELI households are forced to live in places they cannot afford. And that makes them cost burden, sorry. And because more and more people are being squeezed by high rent costs, this puts more people at risk for things like eviction and homelessness. And just to preface again, we are looking at Texas right now, but this is demonstrated across the entire United States. We see this happening in all different kinds of communities, rural and urban. And I think, I'll touch a little bit about how we sort of take this data and use it for sort of our advocacy. But I think one critical thing I would point out here is that when I say that, it puts more people at risk for evictions and homelessness, like this is a way for us to also connect with our homelessness partners and people who are working on more the eviction space, right? Because you can use this data around the lack of affordable housing to really connect it to other experiences as well, including homelessness. And we've seen some of our partners use this data to sort of say that, hey, like we need solutions for homelessness because there's also not enough affordable housing in anywhere, right? So it's a way to sort of interconnect and get into conversations outside of just the more affordable housing space. In the next slide, I think the really critical point here about these are all from our state profile list, and you all can, depending on where you're from, you guys can go to the gap report and kind of see the different state profiles. But these last two graphs that were from our Texas state profile that just came out this month is that the one on the left, at least, it's really important to note here that people that who can work do work, right? So the graph on the left shows us that the overwhelming majority of people who are extremely low income householders, they are in the labor force, and if not, the rest of the majority are seniors or have a disability. So that can really help with the narrative shift, I feel like. We'll get into a little bit around narrative and storytelling in a little bit, but it is really important to highlight that people are in the labor force and people are, just telling us about the demographics of what makes up the population. And I think it probably comes to no surprise to you all that, non-white and Latino households are disproportionately impacted in housing. And so the graph on the right shows us that these communities are more likely to be renters with low income. And we don't include a graph here about those who are cost burdened, but what we know from our data is that nationally, those in non-white Latino households are not only more likely to be extremely low income, but they're also more likely to be cost burdened. So that says a lot about kind of like who is experiencing like the greatest need. And that goes into my next slide where I just want to ground us a little bit around the injustice in housing, because we talked a lot about NLHC's mission, right, around how we advocate for racially and socially just public policy, but we do acknowledge, right, like we have to acknowledge the country's past. We have to acknowledge these different factors to be able to create or advocate for solutions that actually meet people with the greatest needs. So our research goes hand in hand with our mission, and then it goes hand in hand with the policy solutions and the way that we advocate. So we have to talk about native land theft and colonization. We have to talk about, the discrimination that our African American community has faced. We need to talk about how that has infiltrated into zoning codes, loans, right? And then we also need to talk a little bit about the policies that tried to help reshape all those different disparities, but also didn't work at the same time. And then obviously affirmatively furthering fair housing is one of those cases where it's now currently under threat. So we have to understand sort of all these different historical contexts to be able to form kind of like our advocacy structure and how we set up our policy priorities. So I just wanted to mention that piece as well because I do think it's not only woven into our mission, but we're thinking about it in our research. We always talk about the desperate impacts, and then also as practice when we're advocating in different communities. We really do try to stress that there are different impacts for different racial groups, and those with disabilities, those who are citizens, and those who are working families. I know I have talked a lot so far, but I wanted to see if there were any questions or comments anyone has about what we kind of talked about, if there's any clarification or anything that I can make about these things. If not, I can keep on going. But I just wanted to pause.
Yeah, and if you also have like questions as you think about it or comments, you can put them in the chat because that way we could also like address them that way, right?
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I'll keep on going to the next slide. So I will talk a little bit more just about our other annual report, and then we'll go into more of the policy solutions and advocacy piece. But another annual report that we publish at the Coalition is called Out of Reach, which fundamentally helps us demonstrate to folks the gap that exists between housing costs and wages. So in this report, we look at what the hourly wage required to afford a two-bedroom rental home by state. So we also do that state level um, data work similar to Out of Reach. And every year, that report has shown that affordable rental homes are really out of reach for millions of low-wage workers, seniors, families, and other renters. The statistic that we use in the report, which is called the housing wage, It's an estimate that we use of the hourly wage a full-time worker must earn to afford a modest rental home at HUD's what they call fair market rate, FMR, without spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So that's kind of the accepted standard of affordability that they set. And so we use the FMR as a estimate of what a family moving today would expect to pay for a modestly priced rental home in any given area. Um, and when looking at nationally, just giving you a broad landscape of nationally, in 2025, a full-time worker would have needed to earn an hourly wage of $33.63 to afford the average modest two-bedroom rental home in the United States, and $28.17 to afford a modest one-bedroom rental home. And as we know, the federal minimum wage is only 7.25 dollars, which falls short of either wage, whether it was a one bedroom or a two-bedroom household. Um, Next slide, please. So, oh, there we go. So similar to Out of Reach, I'm going to just show the Texas state profile just to put things in a little bit more perspective, because I do think it's useful to go a little bit more at the state level because minimum wages are different across different areas. But I'm showing Texas just to standardize it across Out of Reach um, and for the gap, so you get to see sort of the mismatch between, the affordability and the availability, but then also the wage difference. In Texas, the FMR for a two-bedroom is about $1,500. And so that means in order to afford this level of rent and utilities without paying more than 30% of your income on housing, a household must earn about $5,000 monthly or about $61,000 annually. And so if we're assuming that someone is working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and that the level of income this level of income translates to an hourly housing wage of about $29.64 an hour that you see here on the figure. And so as you can see, like right next to the figure, we list some of the median hourly wages for common occupations on the right side. This tells us that it's pretty much impossible, for some people to be able to afford housing at the wages that exist in Texas, in particular. And what we know now, right after going through the gap report and sort of connecting this with Out of Reach, is that we know that there's a shortage of affordable and available homes, and it's pretty evident with our existing rental housing stock and prices that we can't, that's not sustainable. And then also families being extremely cost burdened and households being extremely cost burdened. And then now we're seeing sort of this mismatch between housing and wages. And so now we're seeing this sort of like impossible moment where families just cannot afford to live in this time. And so we believe that this has not just, serious impacts on housing stability, but this will connect to intersecting issues of access to health, access to education, and the ability to really have upward economic mobility. If you're spending so much money on rent and you're not being paid as much, where does it fall, right? Does it fall on education? Does it fall on health and education? And we have a team, um, NLHC or strategic partnerships. They do a lot of work on working with multi-sector partners who are also touching on education, health, immigration to make sure that we're also sharing this resource and it could be used for something outside of just the housing space because wage differentials are really important. And we know that if it's all going to housing or the majority is going to housing, it must be getting cut out of somewhere else. And this puts us in a little bit of a transition into policy solutions, which we'll go into the next slide. Um, and I know I threw a lot of research at you all, but I think hopefully it gives you a bit of a background as to like what evidence and like how we're approaching policy work, right? Like this is what we're coming with, and this is the evidence that we have, as to why there is such a great need and why we need to focus on the low income, the lowest income renters. And so when we advocate for certain policies at the federal level, we have to keep all these findings in mind, obviously. But I'll note too, right? Like this is our research that we publish, but we are also thinking about what our coalition members are bringing and hearing from on the ground. So it's a mix of both, right? Because we want to lean on, this quantitative research that shows us all these disparities, but we also need to look at some of the more stories, right? We need to look at what our tenant leaders are saying, what are people experiencing, because we know that quantitative data is not going to get us all the way there, but it is a first step in getting us talking about these issues. And, some of our policy solutions are listed here. I'll say for federal appropriations, right? This means that we need to advocate for the highest amount of funding during federal appropriation cycles, and really nailing down the idea that our dollars need to go to, supplying more housing stock and supporting rental assistance programs. Um, I put here strengthen and enforce renter protections. This could also mean acknowledging that just because housing may exist in a specific area, it doesn't mean that it's meeting the standards um, of living or that it protects people from eviction or from facing landlord discrimination, right? We need to increase housing stock, which something that could be supported by, a bigger budget, for example. But the ones that we do have currently, like, are we making sure that our renters are in safe conditions? Are we making sure that they're not, about to face eviction? So we do a little bit of that work as well. And we look at sort of the policy solutions that hit on our renters and their livelihoods just as much as just increasing affordable housing. And so I hope these examples on this policy solution side, the goal is to really show how we approach our policy solutions. And then when we actually get into a little bit of like the advocacy piece and how we approach it, I'll describe a little bit more about how we take all of this and actually mobilize people in our network to take action. So next slide. So before I get into advocacy, I am just providing like a very quick, like real federal policy scenario, right? So there's a lot of conversations right now in Congress around um, the 26, reconciliations and all those kinds of conversations. But right now, there are many people in Congress who are looking at how we're going to spend in FY27, right? They're looking ahead, and this is actually a time when members of Congress are able to submit requests to appropriations committees, both in the House and in the Senate, on where funding should go, right? And we're obviously advocating that a lot of the money should be going to housing programs. And this piece really does dictate a lot of the programmatic and funding priorities for this upcoming fiscal year. So as a coalition, we're really thinking about we need to advocate, every year for like the highest dollar, as I mentioned before, because we know that it's supporting our state and local communities that we serve in our coalition. And as we illustrate in our research, it's a dire need, right? Like we just need more money and we need more funding to be going into these projects. So this is just one example of kind of like how we get, constituents to really like care and to really think about how they can take action because, constituents play a role in all this process because they can submit recommendations on these appropriations requests. So we have take action pages and we have the ability for constituents to email their members of Congress and tell them, hey, like um, we need to advocate for more housing stock in our market. Um, and this goes into our advocacy approach, which I will share next. So overall, we approach our advocacy work through nonpartisan, evidence-based, and a people-centered lens. And then we strongly emphasize the data-driven policy recommendations, which I feel like I've nailed down at this point. Like that is a really big role, plays a really big role in how we approach things. And then we also collaborate with federal, state, and tribal, and then local partners across the country. And then we do this to, number one, build power. This goes through, we talk a lot about advocacy, but part of the work that we all are trying to do on the field team, for example, is organizing, which is different than advocacy, but really trying to build that coalition and trying to get people based off of a shared interest together and to really advocate as a unit. Two, it's growing political will. So this could mean through election engagement. So our friends at the strategic partnerships team, they have a segment called Our Homes, Our Votes, where they're really trying to get housing on as a top priority in the ballot, right? So we're hitting also that election engagement as well, to really tie in all this research, all this policy, and make it a really number one voter issue for people to just think about housing when they go into the ballots. And then just advocacy and pressure. We'll talk a little bit more about advocacy, but I think pressure is really big when we're talking about growing political, like being very persistent about what we want and really, telling our advocates, hey, like, it's not just about calling one time, right? Like, we need to continuously, be asking for things as constituents. And then number three, I think it's advancing policy solutions and really changing systems. And next slide. So, we talk a lot about advocacy about it as three types, right? You have self-advocacy where you're trying to speak up for yourself, and you're trying to communicate and assert the needs or rights that you see fit. We have the individual advocacy where you're focusing on one to two individuals. It doesn't need to be yourself. I think my immediate thought when I think of individual advocacy, I think of like lawyers, or people, experiencing like housing discrimination and having someone, speak up for them, but it doesn't have to be that. And then systems advocacy, I feel like that's where NLHC lies, right? We're trying to build a systems approach to these things. We're trying to change the policies and laws and the rules that impact people. We're trying to build an environment. We're trying to change the environment. We're trying to change how things operate. And then we're also trying to influence at all levels. I will say, we are a systems advocacy approach, but we want people also to have that self-advocacy and individual advocacy as well. And I think one of the ways that we approach, I guess, the self-advocacy portion, because it is really uplifting the work of our tenant leaders and people who with lived experience because we know that they have the power, they have the ability to bring their voices in here, and so it's not necessarily about advocating for them, it's giving them the space to advocate for themselves. And so we really do embrace all kinds of it, but as a coalition, I would say that we fall really under systems advocacy. um, so, yes. And then next slide. Okay, so I'm just gonna stop here and maybe ask a couple questions around some of the maybe research areas that people in the audience are looking at. Maybe some of the issues and maybe how you've engaged in advocacy through that research. How did you work with different stakeholders? Um, I'd love to learn a little bit more about maybe the research areas that you all are interested in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kenza. So anyone likes to get started? I can also get started. Um, well, a lot of the work that I do are also with like housing organizations. So there's like different types of advocacy. Just like for example, one that is like with Texas Appleseed, and I see one student, my PhD student Leslie, is working on that as well. But it's like with about the buyout programs. There's mandatory and voluntary bio programs, which is like where area floods, right? The in this case, like Harris County could say the people that are living in this area with recurrent flooding need to move somewhere else. So something that we put in that report that we like to advocate in Texas with Texas Appleseed is like not having mandatory buyouts, but to have
Mhm.
um, just voluntary buyouts, and inside of that other things like trying to improve communication of like people that are like going through the programs, or like having bilingual um, just information as well, offering a little bit of more money for that people can actually find a median house home, right? Because like as many times when they give you some funding, it's not what actually you can actually buy a home with that, because we give the homes very, very expensive. So that's just one example, but I'm working with like other groups. And sometimes I want to say that that's more on the kind of like more systemic, as you were talking about. But also was thinking about the individual advocacy, because there's another organization, Texas Housers, and this is a project that is like actually funded by you guys. So for this, it's like some people receive homes after Harvey that were like rebuilt homes, right, in the same spot, but their homes were demolished, and then they have the program building a home for them. But then they started to have problems with the home. Sometimes it could be that they have mold. Sometimes like their appliances like stop working, or their HVAC. They didn't have home insurance like expires in a year. But many times they have problems before, but there was like no unresponsive builders. So there, even though a little bit of time already has passed, the idea is like to find people that are having these experiences, and we already have found many, and actually get their documentation and individually advocate for them as a group to see if there's something that can be done.
That's awesome. Anyone else?
Hello, maybe I could add a couple of things. I teach at the University of Cincinnati and the University of Johannesburg, but I work on UN issues, so not housing, but advocacy issues central to the kinds of things I do. So the first example comes from Cities for CEDAW, which is trying to get cities to pay more attention to how the UN does things. And it was interesting. I just started this as a class project. And I might suggest, by the way, on your list of where research comes from, you might add academics to that list. You have students. But it started as a class project. But what I learned very easily is the city council got involved because they were doing something that was an advocacy that kind of fit what they were doing. So it's really important to keep track of whoever it is that you're trying to get to do something, that it fits with whatever. It's just a lot easier than to try to convince them when they're outside of it. When I tried, and in fact, we got the city to do this, I had to put a community organization in place, but I also found I didn't really have the ears of the people who had to make decisions. And so I convinced somebody who was a head of a foundation that had had a city position on finance, so she all knew the city people, and a person who'd been a past president of the city organization to become heads of the community organization. They were really afraid to do this, but the thing is that I said, I'm not going anywhere. I have the information. But because that head of the city organization, women's organization, she contributed to all the people who were running for office. So it's really important to be able to figure out what it is that will get the ears of the people you want to convince. I actually tell people it's a lot easier if you get them to run for office, how much easier it is to be the person who's making the decision than to try to convince somebody. The other example is over mandatory retirement. I've done work in Iceland, South Korea. I'm working now in Sweden and about to do a project in South Africa. We're trying to get a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, so that's my commercial message. But what I've learned from that is how much easier it is in some countries to be able to do things than it is in others. Small is the first requirement. Secondly, figuring out how you get to people. In Iceland, I found I needed to use a new strategy, which was not calling and leaving name and hoping somebody would get back to you. It's asking people, do you know anybody that works in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? And that's how I was able to get in. Out of that, I also could get the email addresses of all the people in their parliament, which is called the all thingy, which I think in English is a very interesting word. I was able to write to each of the members, and many of them wanted to meet with me or wrote back about stuff. So being able to be in communication with people, if you can find somebody who knows somebody, as I mentioned earlier, that really is helpful. And I happened to hit a slow news day in Iceland, and they called me up to go on their national broadcast, which was their most important foreign news show. And I didn't realize that when I was invited. But it's also timing. They'd had a little irregularity in voting in the North, and they thought they were going to be dealing with it, and they didn't have it in their program, so they thought to call me. And I got to go on national television to talk about the work I was doing. So there are a couple of lessons here that you've got to figure out what your strategy is going to be. You have to go visit it periodically because your strategy can change. So you might be going after those individuals you mentioned at one time. Another time you might be looking for a broader strategy, but revisiting it periodically. But I think what I've learned is making your network to be able to move things forward is really important. Anyway, I hope you don't mind my bringing these things up. I realize they're not housing, but they are about trying to make policy changes. For instance, in the UN General Assembly for 14 years was not able to get a convention on the rights of older persons. It's now moved over to the Human Rights Council. So I'm hoping the work I'm doing will help to move this along, and we'll be able to get rid of these, seeing work for older people as a human rights issue, and not just to be nice to them, not to support that there are less young people to contribute to a system, but that you just don't, it isn't happy birthday, you're fired. So anyway, thank you. I'm sorry to take so much time, but maybe there's something there that's useful.
No, I appreciate it, Jan. Yeah, as Brooke said, it's all relevant and we're all trying to advocate together and there's always intersections. So I really appreciate that insight. Um, but yeah, you guys can continue thinking about sort of these questions and then we'll sort of tee up at the end. Maybe I'll post some questions then. But yeah, we'll continue a little bit into, I guess, advocacy, but you know, starting it off a little bit with myths and misconceptions. I mean, I think it's very crazy world, and I think sometimes it's really hard to see how our advocacy moves systems, and that creates, some common misconceptions and myths around, our tax status doesn't allow us to engage in advocacy, our elected officials have already made up their mind and it won't make a difference, and just we just don't have the resources and expertise. And I'd like to say that I don't believe in any of these three things. Personally, I think that we do have definitely the expertise, that's for sure. I think we know where the need is, and I think that we know the solutions. We just need to mobilize and we need to organize and we need to advocate for them. Um, Actually, what a phrase that Billy said, I think it was Billy, I don't know, Brooke, but whatever someone on our team said at our recent conference, it was like a title of a thing. I think it was Power, Use It or Lose It. And I think that speaks to the point here in that if we don't use our power to influence or change systems, that power is just going to be used by others who may not have the interests of the people we are trying to serve in mind. And that I think takes me into my next slide, which is how do we build it? Um, so this is kind of like our framework, and we go through kind of an entire conversation and discussion as an advocacy, or like really the field team, me, Brooke, and the team that we're in about how we actually advocate in a very strategic way. So this is kind of like the steps, I guess. But I really wanted to highlight where I think we all can play a role in this, whether you're in research, whether you're in advocacy, whether you're really that policy wonk. So these are, I think, are kind of the big things, which I think is identifying the issue, which we can do through research and we can do through sort of conversations with folks who are experiencing them, stakeholder engagement. We can set goals for ourselves and we can really develop clear messaging, messaging that is like strategic, and not just sort of sending out an email or just sending or making a phone call. Like, how can we actually think about these things more deeply? Um, and then next slide, we'll talk a little bit about kind of problems versus solutions framework. I mean, I don't think I did a good job at the research portion to tell you about issues because I think I just dropped a bunch of problems at you, right? Like I explained to you kind of the big sort of larger, broader dynamic we're facing in the housing space, which is we just don't have enough housing and everyone is cost burdened and the wages just don't match up with the housing. So that probably wasn't a good example of what we mean by problems versus issues. Um, but when we advocate, for example, on the Hill, we're focusing on like specific issues, right? So things that are a little bit more bite-sized pieces of the problem that can be a little bit more clear and specific and help us really chip away at like these larger problems. So for example, we talked a lot about, or I talked a lot about kind of the lack of affordable and available homes. I talked about how families are being or households are cost burdened. I talked about the disparities. So when you're going, to Congress, you're talking to your members of Congress, you're advocating, you're doing a call to action, right? You're not going to just say, this is all just, you're not going to just list out this big, overwhelming problem. What we think is we need to identify the issues, right? So the issue could be the budget, right? Like there's just not enough money to support rental assistance, right? Like a very specific ask that we can directly tie to and say, hey, like this is something that you should care about. I remember NLHC had, supported a program in which, helping families move into areas of better opportunity, right? We focus specifically on housing vouchers that move people into better opportunity. And because many legislators across the political spectrum really cared about families and their upward economic mobility as a family unit, it got into people's heads. It was a bipartisan ask. And it was a way to kind of clearly identify an issue and kind of work to solve it in a bite-sized, sort of digestible way that wasn't overwhelming and it wasn't necessarily that process wasn't necessarily strategic if you made it as broad as it was. And this kind of goes into our advocacy activities on the next slide. As a national coalition, we do urge our members and partners to take actions at all levels, right? So we focus a lot on federal policy, and many of them actually, they just came to Washington, D.C. to join our Capitol Hill Day, and they met with their federal delegation and their staffers, and that's super important. But we also advocate for them to go to their state capitals, to talk to, state level, local level officials, talk to their congressmen and women when they're back in their home districts for recess. Um, we we ask that our members and advocates directly do a call to action to a direct sort of bill, direct sort of action. Um, and Going into the next slide. When we talk about engaging with our policymakers, there's also a little bit of strategy that goes into it. And I think, Jan, you kind of referenced this a little bit about how we engage with those in power and how we kind of be a little bit more specific and strategic. So what we say is, always researching your policymakers, right? What committees are they sitting on? Are they in Housing and Urban Affairs? Are they in a committee that cares more about, education or health? Is there a way to sort of tie those intersecting ideas in? Do they carry any specific positions? either committee level or previous positions, and even maybe where do they come from, right? Like what district are they from? Is it in a rural community? Can we hit on those nodes, right? Can they support this bill that is trying to support Native communities or tribal communities because they live in a state that has, the tribal and Native communities. So we're really thinking about who the audience is and then tailoring your message to align with those priorities. We're also thinking about establishing ongoing relationships. And so that means not necessarily just utilizing maybe one channel at one period, but establishing an ongoing relationship. So we tell, our Capitol Hill Day recipients, right, like sending a follow-up, right? And like sending a follow-up after you meet with them, really keying in on how they need to take action, what's the timeline, how to do so. And then also utilizing, I said, multiple channels. That can mean letters, that can mean meetings, social media, public testimony, all of these different things. And then going into the next piece, which I think is sort of our bread and butter as a field team, and those who are working on the ground with other or working with people on the ground who are doing sort of this organizing work and who are doing really great state and local level work. It's the grassroots organizing and mobilization. So I said, we are all in part of the advocacy space, but we are also trying to develop and trying to support those who are organizing at the grassroots level and really mobilizing them to create coalitions within themselves. And so that means, recommending, doing outreach, going to community meetings, going to town halls, really utilizing social media to build that really large base of support and then recruiting and bringing in people into a coalition so that way everyone who has that shared interest understand that there is a place for you to advocate, right? It's like building that base and that structure for people who maybe have that self-advocacy and maybe making it into systems advocacy, right? Like how can we create spaces for people to join in coalition with one another so it's not just self-advocacy. Why can't it be both, right? Like can we have self-advocates and then can we also have systems advocates? And so I think that's part of the engaging with communities piece and how we approach our advocacy. And then I think, one of the critical things I think connects us all, no matter what dynamic or what field, or sort of part of this larger ecosystem of advocacy, I think is storytelling. We work closely with the Housing Narrative Lab, who has really great resources on how to tell your story. Because we know it's not just about what you say, it's also about how you say it and the audience that you have. So we provide some guidance, especially those with lived experience who are, brave enough and open enough to share about their experiences with housing insecurity or homelessness, on storytelling practices. And so these are kind of like the guides that we provide around, effective emotional appeal, and then also sort of structuring your storytelling in a way that ends off with a call to action, and then also has that climax where you're able to share about some of the adversities, but also connect it directly to something that you want to change. So you're not just telling a story of yourself, you're telling a story of us, right? That coalition or that group that you're a part of, and then telling a story of action. Like how do you want this to be actualized in real life? And going on to the next slide, and this is where I love ending off on things, which is talking about engaging people with lived experience. I had the pleasure to work with many people when I was doing my research with housing voucher recipients, and I think that is why I do the work that I do right now because I just really enjoy learning about their stories. But I think it can create a deeper understanding and empathy for folks, but at the same time, we also have to be mindful about doing so in very respectful ways. And so we kind of have some do's and don'ts of ways of engaging people with lived experience, and we're still in the process of how do we engage people with lived experience in our coalition? And it's a growing effort. But we do say, asking for permission and not just assuming people want to be vocal all the time. We talk about treating people as authentic partners in decision making and agenda setting power. So in our, we have a bunch of tenant leaders that work with us. And NLHC, it's about really partnership rather than saying, hey, tell us your stories and we're gonna put this out there. It's how do you engage in our work? At the conference that we recently have, we have a tenant leaders convening, right, where they all come and they're leading discussions on housing and they're telling us what we need to do and how we need to shape our policy priorities. And so that like partnership, I think, is really important. And of course, compensation. I think this is the piece that, everyone is working on, which is how do we compensate people for their, not just their time, but for their like expertise. Because people with lived experience have expertise, they're the ones who have navigated the systems themselves. And so how do we compensate them, I think is um, a really critical question. I think in the policy and advocacy space, but I think also in the research space. And then don't, right? How do we don't want to tokenize, we don't want to exploit trauma, and we definitely don't want to approach engagement as sort of just a check off the box sort of approach. So that's something that we think about often as advocates, working with different partners on the ground. How do we do that in the most effective way, in a way that's empathetic and sympathetic to their experiences. Um, so that is next slide. So yeah, I we can go through kind of like maybe what resonated with you from this presentation, if there was anything you would want to learn more about, and maybe what you might be inspired to do next. It could be advocacy, it could be policy, but I'm interested to hear kind of where people might go next with this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kenza and Brooke. I was wondering if you have like any advice for people that, again, like if you're in, there's a lot of like younger scholars here, I think as well, and they're doing their studies, right, concentrating on that. Perhaps some of them are working with advocacy groups, but maybe some are not, but are right now theoretically engaging with advocacy work and would like to actually learn how can they do that better and how to approach maybe organizations that they can work with. So I was wondering if you have like any advice of like maybe it's up. I you mean I know that you engage with already with like some scholars, right? And that the relationships sometimes are not um are not that clear. It's like, people meet people just because you get introduced to somebody, and that's kind of like how many things. Sometimes there might not be like a formal way of like, hey, like guys, I'd like to do this or that. But it's like how like if you wanted to work with an advocacy organization, right? And then there might not be, because I think for most there are not like a formal way of doing that. How do you recommend that people try to engage with an advocacy organization like yours?
You want me to take it, Kenza?
I feel like you might have more to say about this.
Um, yeah, I'm happy to, and feel free to weigh in on anything else I missed. But I think that's a really good question, Ivis. I think so. Kenza has one more slide after this conversation, but she'll talk a little bit about membership. But more generally speaking, I think NLIHC in particular has a unique our field team that Kenza's talked about it's a unique bridge into folks like you all, advocates, researchers, different folks in our network, to be that kind of outlet. So Kenza and our other organizers on the team can really serve as like a resource and an ongoing like contact to stay engaged with the work at NLHC specifically. And I think there are other advocacy organizations as well that do this. We have two webinars a month that provide updates on Capitol Hill, and then also on like, field work, like people in this state are doing something related, and like how that federal work translates to the state and local work. So that's a great way for folks to kind of tune in, keep their finger on the pulse, and learn about new advocacy actions that folks can take. So webinars, staying in touch with the organizer, and then also our email listserv if you sign up for that, which I can drop some of these in the chat. Links to those things to sign up for them, all free and easy to access at whatever capacity you have. The emails we send out calls to action, as well as updates every week on what's happening. So you can kind of at your own pace, before I worked at NLHC, I would kind of just skim through to see what the latest news was on the federal advocacy level. And as I had time, take action, contacting my members of Congress about different things. And also, like, depending on your organization, I know Ivis, you meant at the or mentioned at the beginning, if you can't weigh in on a specific bill, you can always educate folks on the general issue at hand and some potential solutions that may or may not happen to also be in the bill. But that's one way you can participate in advocacy without crossing any lines there.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's other people with questions or thoughts.
To move on unless someone has anything. But my last, like Brooke said, the last slide is more about membership. So as Brooke said, I mean, membership is a great way to get involved and looped into, housing advocacy organizations. We have a lot of many things going on, and I'm sure if you went onto our website, you would find different tabs and different research reports and different actions that we're taking. But I do think that, joining a newsletter and become, for us at least, we have memo to members. So that's a way for our members to get sort of a brief snapshot of what it is that we're working on, what's coming up the pipeline, how can you get involved. We also have, like Brooke dropped in the chat, webinars that we host that kind of keep you in the loop. But I do think becoming members of organizations that you align with, especially, for us, we really want to bring in those in the housing space to be able to even be in community with one another. So, our sometimes our member meetings are really about, hey, like, what do you think about our policy priorities for this upcoming year? How, what do you want to see on the docket? In our advocacy efforts, in our policy priorities. So that is a great way. We listed some of the sort of benefits of membership. We just had our annual policy forum that we throw every year where advocates from all across the country and different industries come together. So those are just a couple of other things, and you guys can all feel free to reach out to us and sign up for our emails. Find your field team member that Brooke has dropped in the chat. And yes, so I think that pretty much concludes the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or any insight or any recommendations for this presentation or any feedback. But thank you so much for your time, and I'm really happy to have been here to share with you all what we do.
Yeah, I wanted to see if more people have questions, but yeah, well, I just wanted to say thank you. I think that we went from looking and learning about what's your mission, some of your key reports, and all that. Looking at how you produce a lot of data, right, that you can use, and obviously us as researchers can be key to develop some data, share it with people, organizations that we work, or again, just even put it like in the media, right? That's kind of could be a form of advocacy, and people pay attention to those things. And then also you give us some ideas of like how we might collaborate with advocacy organizations like yours. So I think that again, this has been really great. Thank you so much, Kenza and Brooke, for your time and also for doing this work. Um, so I am going to just put here in the chat. We have like another webinars coming up. These ones are more about get your money, NSF funding, which is always a good way, like something I have found actually, like I see a grant and then I know a nonprofit organization, or maybe sometimes I might not know the nonprofit organization, but I know that they do work that is related, and I might approach them. Do you want to, um, uh, do this grant together? And that's a great way of like doing a relationship, finding something that the advocacy organization wants to be done, right? I think that we start from there. This is something that they also want to do, and to get compensated, which was one of the things that you said as well in the to-dos. So our next talk is going to be from someone that was a former program director. Perhaps when there was more time, more funding available. But he will be talking more about the ins and outs of like how to put together a good proposal and things like that. So I think there are things that are very helpful for NSF because he has those insights, but also it could be applicable to other grant making. And then that's like there's two parts of this because he has a lot to say. So it's like April 3rd and April 10 from 11 to 12:30, and it'll be great if you register for both so you can follow. But we also like will record these and post online. They're not like available for everyone, but they're available really for members, really. So if you are a ACSP member, you should be able to log in and see the different webinars that we have. And again, I don't see any questions on the chat. If you want Brooke and Kenza to put your email on the chat, sometimes it might be easier than for people to type it. Um, and so, yes, excellent. So that is very helpful. And I also saw that Brooke put a lot of information about like webinars. And those are great. So you can keep all kinds of news. So I highly recommend you to get those. And I know we're all busy and we might not make most of them, but maybe you'll make some of them. And that's a good thing. Well, thank you so much to everyone, but especially Kenza and Brooke for spending this time with us. And have a great day or a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivis. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thanks.